the fastest growing Jewish organization in the United States, with chapters all over the country, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Our rabbinical council of several dozen members, a vibrant youth wing, an academic council of prominent faculty, and an advisory board that includes luminaries such as Randy Klein, Noam Chomsky, Tony Kushner, and Drew Butler, just to name a few of them. So when I think about just the last few months, 2,100 Palestinians in Gaza killed, including almost 79 Israelis, newly segregated buses in the West Bank, the takeover of Palestinian homes in the Jerusalem neighborhood still run by government-backed settlers. And those are just the headlines, of course, not the daily grind of the humiliations and deprivations of life and occupation. I do wonder sometimes why we still have to have a conversation about what is right and what is just. Any doubt that to destroy olive trees or throw stone without someone who visits the scenes a few miles from their home, all things I've seen by the Palestinians in my own eyes, are absolutely not justifiable, not in any security or fear, and certainly not in Jewish values. And I think it's also important to emphasize that these are the acts of the state, not the people. The Jews are not responsible for Israel's policies. Unfortunately, the Israeli government is doing its utmost to claim it speaks for all Jews around the world. Next slide. Just this week, in response to reports of a member of the Obama administration calling Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu another choice name that was quoted in audit saying that the Prime Minister is not a private person, but the leader of the Jewish state and the Jewish world. Such severe curse words against the Israeli Prime Minister are harmful to millions of Israeli citizens and Jews worldwide. Jewish Force for Peace and other groups like us are here to say this conflation of the same, making it as a small organization that could have an impact. But it could not only be in solidarity with Palestinians who are asking us to take this step, and a global community with activists worldwide who are doing the same, but it gives us a tool we can use, a way to have an influence beyond government structures and lobbying. The very act of researching, deciding on a target, planning or implementing a campaign, whether it's against Caterpillar or a film, or a lecture like this one, or your opinion come to a demonstration during a bombing, to someone who's doing this work year-round. I'm an evangelist for campaign work, not just because of the potential wins, but because it's only by having campaigns that we can hope to build our movement. And building our movement is the greatest hope we have for actual change. On a personal note, I realized I became convinced of the importance of the ES when I was living in Tel Aviv in 2009. My husband was Israeli, so my children lived there from 2006 to 2009, and my children were very small when we were during Operation Cast Lead, and I would drop my children in preschool, and everybody would say, good morning, just like people were getting out of the way, and I would say, I'm not good, there was terrible war going on, and people were sort of on the left side of the Israeli spectrum, and would say, oh yes, that's terrible, but the company is racist and we're concerned. And if they're more on the right wings of the spectrum, they would sort of give you this, super American world. And that was the extent of their belief of what was happening. And so I really became convinced then that Israelis will not make this change on their own, that the status quo is too comfortable for them. Only outside pressure is going to force the issue. And the Jewish world in the United States recognizes that BDS is the greatest threat to a change in the status quo. And they are way more scared of BDS than they ever were of the peace process. For that reason, Jewish institutions are putting literally millions of dollars a year into fighting BDS on every level. They make BDS a red line, and they can call BDS anti-Semitic outright or read anti-Semitism into its principles. But we strongly disagree. How can it be anti-Semitic to hold a state, any state, including Israel, accountable for its human rights violations, for enforcing inequality, and for its systems of oppression? In fact, misuse of the term anti-Semitism makes a mockery of truly anti-Semitic acts, and makes it dangerously possible for people to take true anti-Semitism less seriously. So training for the BS movement in the U.S. similarities for us to use the lessons of that movement. Can you do the next slide? Oops, keep going. Okay. There we go. It's a complicated slide, and we won't read it off in there, but what this basically is a very interesting analysis of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. And so it looked at pension funds, TIFF, which is a pension fund that JDP is actually targeted along with allies, the Ford Foundation, some major universities and major churches, and it tracks from 1971 until 1987 the actions of these institutions were willing to take around their investment. And it started with information seeking, going to things like restricting several products, to disinvestment and public investment, and all the way up to new monetary ties with foreign firms, and that's in 1987. So you can see the, in retrospect, you sort of see the trajectory of the intensification of in this case, the divestment movement. And I think we are moving along that trend. Again, you guys are further along than we are, but we are having the kinds of issues, the kinds of institutions that just weren't possible even a few years ago. So it's very, very encouraging. And so not surprisingly, there's other forces, the opposition forces are pushing back harder than ever. And racism and Islamophobia are playing a key role in how the Israel lobby maintains its grip in the United States. And a lot of the largest Jewish organizations in the United States, ones that fund settlers and settler militias, are also fomenting Islamophobia strategically in the United States as a way for the U.S. to continue to support Israel. But in the New York Times, for example, the paper of record in the United States, you can see over and over again how Palestinian lives are devalued compared to those of Jewish Israelis. You only have to compare the coverage of the kidnapping murder of the 3 Yeshiva boys in June to the execution in cold blood of 2 Palestinian boys in May by the Israeli army to take only one of too many examples to understand the subtle and not so subtle ways that the media reinforces its ranking of human value. Next slide. Sorry. This is a reprint of a tweet from Yusuf who keeps good track of the media in the U.S. And I couldn't find the original headline because the New York Times actually scrubbed it from its website, but the original headline was, "Missile at Beachside Gaza Cafe finds patrons poised for World Cup." That was the headline that they ran when 8 people were killed by missiles over the summer. Yusuf said who was the missile moving for. And so you can see how they're trying to obscure the fact that people are being killed in cold blood civilians with this kind of thing, which sounds like it's an article about the World Cup. Now, there was a concentrated effort to get the headline changed, and so it was changed later to "In the local Gaza Seaside Cafe, hunt for victims who had come for the World Cup" or something. And 8 people were killed by a missile. And this is just one little example of the way the New York Times, this summer especially, I think it progressed. On the op-ed pages now, you can see actually some pretty good writing, but in the news side this summer, worse than I think I've ever seen it. So even though there's been a concerted effort to address these kinds of really obvious kinds of egregious examples, it really is it's been a bit of an uphill battle. And now, as the new strategy, a key talking point that we're hearing from the Israeli government, to the lobby, to people you meet on the street, is to try to eliminate Hamas and ISIS. The truth is that the two have 2 entirely different political projects. While ISIS seems to seek an Islamic caliphate without territorial limits, which implies some kind of need for global domination or desire for global domination, Hamas is essentially a national liberation movement whose ambitions don't go beyond the borders of historic Palestine. So this fear-mongering really has a strategic purpose: to create the idea of one giant Muslim menace. The emphasis of this talking point is obviously being used to cover up and redirect from Israel's violence and oppression. However, luckily, these kinds of talking points are working less and less well on the younger generation. And we have now alternative sources of news like Margot Weiss and the Electronic Intifada to get accurate news when the New York Times doesn't provide it. And they also have a different sense of history, right? A different moment in history. So Peter Weiner, who's a liberal Jewish writer, wrote this summer, he said, younger Americans are less white, less religious, less nationalistic, and less racist. The harder they find it to conceive of Israel as a democracy, the harder they'll find it to support Israel's existence as a Jewish state. So it follows then that the older and whiter you are in the United States, the more likely you are to support Israel. Could you do the next slide? And I do want to note that a big part of that is the evangelical population in the United States. 29% of the American population are evangelical Christians. They align themselves with AIPAC and other elements of the Jewish side of the lobby. And it's a pretty uncomfortable alliance, although AIPAC has embraced it. The Christian evangelicals, the reasons that they are supporting Israel is because they're trying to hasten the coming of the apocalypse. So I think, it certainly doesn't have a good ending for Jews, and so it's going to be like, it's good anti-Semitic at its core. But that is an alliance that is a big part of the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby in the United States. And the third part of that lobby is the military complex, which of course the military contractors have to get, are automatically get Israel makes its contracts through to get its money from the United States through the U.S. military contractors. So military contractors come to gain from the U.S. aid to Israel, $3 billion that we give to Israel in military aid. So the combination of the Jewish communal lobby, the Christian evangelical wing, and the military industrial complex are pretty formidable. But we are seeing also parallel to the Jewish population changing attitudes. Also, we're hearing that Christian evangelicals are actually also starting to change. Younger ones are starting to question the older generation's narrative. Enough so that Kofi, which is Christians United for Israel, has publicly expressed concern about losing the younger generation of evangelicals. So that's interesting that it's a phenomenon that's not just limited to the Jewish world, but to the Christian evangelical world. And you can see that in this chart. So this is a chart that says it's about whether or not you agree with the statement, I sympathize more with Israel. Now the numbers, of course, are very high. You can see Americans 65 plus, at 60% they support that. But you can see that there's a clear downward trend. So Americans under 30, only 44%, I believe, agree with the statement, I sympathize more with Israel, so less than 50%. So it's not as much as we would like, but it's absolutely shifting. So while Jewish communal perspectives on Israel are profoundly shifting, they are not represented at all, and in fact are desperately shut out by mainstream Jewish institutions. Several years ago, the same Peter Weiner earlier wrote really a seminal essay called The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment, about how the Jewish community in the U.S. has actually held on to its liberal values and how that leads us further and further away from an affinity with Israeli policies that are moving ever to the right. Next slide. So this is a different question, so it's not parallel to the previous slide, but this is whether you agree with the statement, Israel isn't making a sincere attempt to make peace. And the first column, Jews 18 to 29, 25% of them agree with that statement, while only 5% of Jews 50 plus agree with that statement. So you can see there's quite a vast difference between young Jews and older Jews about their perspectives on what Israel is doing. But despite this, the mainstream Jewish institutions aren't moving yet. And they're, in fact, starting to impose litmus tests on what's permissible to talk about in the American, and I'm interested in hearing later in our discussion also in the British Jewish communities. 2 weeks ago, I was at Harvard participating in the first Open Hillel conference, which was organized entirely by students. It's a movement that was founded to fight the rules that Hillel International, the Jewish umbrella organization on college campuses, has imposed that excludes Jewish students if they support any form of the BDS movement, or, in their words, that delegitimize or hold Israel to a double standard, which is rather vague language. So those rules, which have been created just in the last few years, to me are actually an indication that big organizations know that they are losing ground in the ideological battle. Like other organizations, which, for example, are creating blacklists of faculty who speak out in favor of Palestinian rights, they're no longer trying to convince by the power of their argument, but by ensuring silence through fear and intimidation.
So that's our form of progress in the US, I'm afraid to say. The students of Open Hillel are challenging their elders, who of course also hold the purse strings, saying that they want their community to be a place of open debate. So we had 2 days of spirited debate and discussion. All of the right-wing groups were invited, none deigned to participate. But nevertheless, there was rigorous and challenging discussion from the center to the left, and the sky did not fall. So this, I think, is an enormous challenge to Hillel, and by extension to other major Jewish organizations in the Jewish world. Are they really willing to jettison the thoughtful and committed young people that Open Hillel represents? That is the question that they are now facing. But even beyond the guidelines and the limits being enforced upon internal Jewish conversations, concerted strategic attacks are being made in a broader arena. Last year, for example, the American Studies Association passed a resolution endorsing academic boycott. Immediately, there was an enormous and intense backlash. In 4 states, New York, Maryland, Illinois, and Florida, legislation was hastily written to try to financially penalize institutions that allowed this boycott resolution to go forward. I know the New York story the best because I'm based in New York. And the legislation was brought forward by the single most powerful state legislator in New York State. And again, it was going to impose fiscal sanctions on the public universities. It had already passed in the Assembly when we found out about it, and it was due in the Senate in a matter of days. It seemed absolutely unstoppable. But JDP was able to build a coalition along with the Center for Constitutional Rights, and most critically, the faculty union. And that might not sound that unusual to all of you. I know the trade unions here are very, very active on this issue, but in the US, the labor movement is completely absent on this issue. It's the first time we ever built a coalition with the labor movement. They fought this legislation tooth and nail. We had a visit with the New York Times editorial board, next slide, and we actually, the New York Times actually in an editorial, which we'll see in a second, came out strongly against this assault on freedom of speech, which I'm sure went straight to the governor's office, and we were able to kill this legislation, as we were able to kill it. And I think that the lesson here is that, which is really critical, is that politicians can no longer try to score political points by pushing through mindless pro-Israel legislation, that we're at the point where we can impose a cost, and that's a very critical new moment that we're at. So while the public universities are facing threats to state-based funding, private universities are also facing similar challenges with the threats of donors to withdraw money. And that's part of a broader and very disturbing assault on higher education, which is beginning to place limits on curriculum and what is spoken about based on who gives funding. And that's not limited to Israel and Palestine. But the most prominent example of that this summer, I'm sure many of you know the story, is about Professor Steve Salaita. He was hired, he was a tenured professor at Virginia Tech. He got a job offer about 9 months in advance. In September, he was due to start work at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. 2 weeks, and they knew what they were getting, by the way. He had written a book several years ago called Israel's Dead Soul. So it wasn't that he was not public about his perspective on Israel. During the summer, he was tweeting a lot. During the summer, he was very angry, as you can imagine, about what was happening with Israel and Gaza. He wrote some intemperate tweets, which on Twitter, as many of you know, people are often very intemperate. But just 2 weeks before the semester started, he was told that actually he wasn't hired. That the sort of rubber stamp of the trustees, which is sort of the standard thing that faculty have to go through, which really is not part of the hiring process, because the hiring process is supposed to be in the hands of the faculty, not the administration, that he was not going to get his job. And emails were actually linked, showing that this was based on very explicit pressure from donors who said they would withdraw their money if he kept his job. And what was even more disturbing was that he was, again, fired, fired is probably a better word actually, but people were saying dehired, based on charges of incivility by the administration, which we hear a lot on this issue, then they're not going to learn anything at all. So they're really trying to narrow the acceptable academic discourse, and it actually harkens back in birth legislation that was targeting Israel and that made them feel uncomfortable. Of course, the idea that Palestinian students on campus, this was shortly after Cass led, that they might feel uncomfortable about their university being invested in companies that were profiting from bombing their own families was not considered a legitimate reason. So this concept of incivility and discomfort is applied very, very selectively. But going back to the Steve Saleta affair, I think what's different from previous examples that we know of, Norman Finkelstein, other people have had tenure denied. I don't know of another case quite like this one of Steve Saleta not being able to get his job at all. But what's happening with this story is that it's not going away. A huge array of people are coming into his defense. 5,000 faculty have said they will not visit his campus until he's reinstated. And 16 departments have passed no confidence votes. And so this has really become a referendum on freedom of academic expression that does go beyond Israel-Palestine as inspiring faculty who are not supporters of BDS to finally take action, because they can see that the whole accepted standards of academic discourse are in jeopardy. So there's a bit of an overreach going on, and there's that backlash. So we also have student groups facing concerted attacks. There's more examples, unfortunately, that can be mentioned, so I just wanted to tell quickly the story of something that happened yesterday, actually. The Students for Justice in Palestine group at Loyola College, Loyola University maybe, Students for Justice in Palestine, for those of you who don't know, is the most amazing and organized and active and effective student group on campuses in the United States. They just had 500 students at their national meeting. The first national meeting was only, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, so they're growing phenomenally right now. But SJP Loyola, Hillel had a table at a student event that was promoting birthright trips. Everyone knows what birthright is, right? It's trips that only Jewish students are qualified for to go to Israel. It's like a 2-week propaganda trip. And so what the students of SJP decided to do fairly spontaneously was Palestinian students stood online at this table and tried to sign up for birthright. and they were using that as a way to illustrate the discriminatory nature of the program. So as a result of that, they were suspended for a week, and they were subjected to an intensive investigation, and they were charged with 6 administrative violations. Now, luckily, we now have something called the Palestine Legal Solidarity Project, which is a wonderful group of lawyers who are helping students and faculty and others who are facing this kind of pressure. So we're very lucky that we now have a legal team that's available for cases like this one. But yesterday, they were cleared of 5 of the 6 charges, but they were still found responsible, this is ironic, they were still found responsible for the charge of violating the free expression and demonstration policy because they did not properly register their impromptu action. Hillel was found responsible for failing to register their birthright tabling event as well. But despite the fact that they were both found responsible for failing to properly register, Hillel is now only required to attend a training on how to register events, probably pretty boring, while Loyola SJP was sanctioned with probation until the end of the school year. And they're required to attend something called the intergroup dialogue training, which sounds very Orwellian. But the notice in the legal decision says it's an effort to support SJP's skill development in exercising alternatives to approaching difficult dialogues. So you can see the kind of uneven treatment and discriminatory policies that students and faculty are facing on this issue on campuses. And these policies are really being driven by Jewish organizations like Amcha, which recently published this blacklist of Middle East studies professors who they no longer consider kosher because they support BDS. They're systematically, along with other organizations like the Brandeis Center, trying to monitor and defund Middle East studies programs and individual professors by tarring them with the accusation of anti-Semitism. Of course, their definition of anti-Semitism includes anything they consider anti-Israel speech, and it's intended entirely to suppress and stifle any debate. What's encouraging to me is how much pushback there is to these efforts. Shortly after AMCA published its blacklist, a group of Jewish studies professors, many of them actually quite Zionist and pro-Israel, put out a public letter decrying these tactics. It was a very, very strong letter. So in other words, on campus and off, the organized Jewish community has really almost given up on winning through the force of argument, and instead are relying on fear and intimidation to enforce their narrative. And they're really beginning to fail, despite despite the difficulty of the many people who are going through these kinds of examples that I mentioned. I don't think there's any way that this situation can hold. What has intensified after this summer in the US is an acceleration of a trend that was already in place, and that is more and more visible. It's really apparent in all spheres, from the media to what politicians say behind closed doors, to the conversation parents are having with their children. In every way, there's a new understanding of the role that Israel plays, and more willingness to say it out loud. There's a website called Jezebel, which is like a website for young feminist women in the United States. And there was recently a little story about how things were playing out locally in Pittsburgh around Israel-Palestine. It was actually about a restaurant that was serving Palestinian food. But it was almost like they were also getting pushback from the Jewish community because they didn't get equal time at this restaurant. But anyway, but there was comments about this little brouhaha in Pittsburgh. And this is a website. It's political, but it's sort of it's a general interest website. It's for younger people, and these comments were sort of over and over again. People were saying, I don't really know much about this issue. And one person put it best, is they sort of said, I don't know much about this issue, but the one thing that anyone can see is that Israel is the bully in the playground, and it's kicking the kid who's already lying in the dirt. And I think that change in understanding and perception of Israel is really the key. We need this change in discourse as a prerequisite for change in policy. And I think as we hear more and more stories about young people challenging their parents on the narrative, the closer we realize we are to, and we realize the panic that the organized Jewish community has because they're losing control of this narrative. And at JVP, to bring it back to JVP, we understand this more than ever after this awful summer. We were the only major Jewish organization in the United States to unequivocally oppose what was being done to Gaza, and we are now literally 3 times the size we were at the beginning of June. Next slide. We have this is a map of JVP chapters. We have 31 new chapters this summer. We went from 40 chapters at the beginning of June to 71 chapters. You can see we're still a little short in Idaho and Wyoming and Montana, but there aren't that many people there anyway. But 3 chapters in Texas. For those of you who know the United States, it's a very conservative state. 2 chapters in Florida. There's a very organized conservative Jewish community there, so 2 chapters in Florida is kind of amazing. On the East Coast, you can hardly even see the map anymore. Those are local groups that are forming, and it's not just the new groups that we have. Our existing groups became so much stronger this summer because they were out every day on the streets, many times a week, and they're larger and larger than they were. We have 60,000 new online supporters, so our online supporters list is now up to 200,000. And the next slide, please. Our Facebook likes, which is in some ways a silly metric, but it's an indicator of the way things are changing. At the beginning of June, we had 57,000 Facebook likes, and we now have 190,000. So you can see there on the left, Facebook likes. JVP is the tall column all the way on the left up at almost 200,000. The third column at 82,000 likes is APAC. And that little column over on the right is J Street, 24,000. Next slide. This is also another metric comparison. These are YouTube views during the month of July 25th to August 21st. You can see that JVP had 1.3 million video views and 21,000 likes. APAC, on the other hand, had 1 million views, but only 725 likes. 725, not 725,000. And J Street down there had 304,000 video views and 1.3 thousand likes. So you can see that, again, in the battle of public opinion, we're starting to really just absolutely outstrip all of these other organizations. So the way that we understand this growth is that people desperately needed us this summer. Jews needed a place to grieve, to rage, and to be on the streets, and to voice their opposition to Israeli actions and still be part of a Jewish community. In fact, we are both challenging established institutions like Hillel and creating our own alternative structures. JDP is a community for students and professors and rabbis and actors and teachers and retired people and every other kind of person you could possibly meet. Creating these new communities are incredibly important, given the difficulty of expressing the opinions we face in our own homes and our synagogues and the wider community. JDP is a place where you can be your full self, checking neither your Jewishness.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can everybody hear? We're without. No. Do we need a mic? Rachel, is there a mic around? Can we take that one off? No, it's stuck. All right. We're going to try without a mic. Tell me in the back. Is that? Oh, you can hear me. Oh.
No, that's
It won't go. So, I think it's taped. Give us a second. We're going to see if someone's going to. I thought I was projecting really well.
That might have to happen.
Do you want to move the seats back up to here? Because it
Yeah,
might be broken weights not going to work.
Yeah. Or can we move the podium can't move?
I think if we could just get another one of these chairs.
Evening, everyone. So, I'm going to start off the conversation part, which is really for all of you to ask questions of Rebecca. We say of progressive ideas and, above all, for peace and against aggressive Israeli policies that were being expressed there. What I find really interesting is what you're doing is that you're leading the way in America without that happening so much in Israel. And you've talked about a personal finding no response when you were talking about being upset about what was going on during Operation Cast Lead. But what the question I'm coming to is something about, you know, a lot of Jewish people I know that are very active on Palestine say, well, I'm active on this because, not because I'm Jewish, but because I'm a human being, and this is an issue of human rights, and this is a universal issue, and it matters to me, and if I wasn't Jewish, I would care. However, there's a very important role that you play as a Jewish group, both dealing with the Jewish community, but in the broader public. And I think what I really like is you to kind of highlight and maybe articulate what that is, and what you see the role of Jewish Voice for Peace playing, while holding to those universal principles, but as a Jewish group today in America.
So first of all, I mean, JDP is an interesting organization because there's a broad spectrum of the kind of Jewish identity that people have for inside JDP. There are people who, especially I think the founding generation of JDP, most of them were people who were from the left. And they chose on this issue to be active with a Jewish identity because they knew that it had additional oomph when they used their Jewish identity. One of the interesting things that we've seen as time has gone on, as we attract a lot of younger people, that I find really fascinating, and of course this is a complete generalization, but a lot of the younger people actually have a strong Jewish practice. They may not have a leftist perspective overall on the world, this may be the only political issue they work on, or sometimes they work also on environmental issues. I mean, they work on environmental issues and immigrant issues, so maybe that's not true, it's the only issue. But the point is that they have a strong Jewish identity that has to do with the Jewish practice, and because of that, they have no problem at all identifying themselves as anti-Zionists, because their Jewish identity is placed elsewhere. While the secular sort of founding generation of JVP, I come from that generation, I suppose, and those that are a little older than me, for many of us, our Jewish identity came more from Israel than anything else. And especially folks, I mean, I belonged to a synagogue growing up, and I still do, and so I'm a little different. But for a lot of people, that Israel was their Jewish identity. So there is a wide range of type of Jewish identity that there is within JVP. And I think we also play two different roles. One is, again, creating this safe space for Jewish people as they're coming out on this issue. And I think more and more that's incredibly important, this creating and offering an alternative community, because if we don't, it's just too hard. It's often just too hard. But then we also provide a voice in the non-Jewish community. And I think the universal perspective is the most important thing there, that because we have a universal rights framework, we can enter into true partnerships with all different kinds of communities. And we have very strong partnerships with Muslim groups, Arab groups, African American groups, indigenous rights organizations, LGBTQ groups, all kinds of groups all along the spectrum, because we're all really fighting the same struggle. It may be on different specific issues, but we have the same values and principles, and so we're all part of the same movement. So we're able to work as a piece of that larger movement, and I think that's what gives us a lot of our power.
Thank you.
Here, so I'd like to have the first round of questions if people raise their hands. Over there, gentleman with the glasses. Yes?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've been on the JDP email list for many years, so I already had some idea about your great work, and then you told us even more. I'm especially interested in your comment, the conversation, that many Jews who've been able to intervene in Jewish organizations and facilitate splits, debates, or whatever.
Very quick question. You are a protest movement. Is your ultimate aim one state, two state, or are you not thinking that far ahead?
And one more. Yes, sir.
How far do you think the support of Israel by America is determined by the powerful Israel lobby, and how far by how the administration sees what the administration sees as America's own interests, particularly in the area of weapons research and security? In other words, if the Israel lobby didn't exist, would Israel still not be supporting Israel? Would America not still be supporting Israel?
Okay, this would be a challenge to remember all three. The first question was about helping to sort of encourage other kinds of splits in Jewish institutions. Open Hillel is the best example so far. We do have this rabbinical council of several dozen rabbis, and so some of them are congregational rabbis and some of them are not, but they do a lot of creating alternative Jewish liturgies that people can use, and alternative Jewish ceremonies and that sort of thing, which I think have been quite useful on the local level for people who want a more inclusive kind of observance, but is not really a direct challenge to institutions. We do have sort of a new growing network called the Open Synagogues Network, which we quite consciously sort of fashioned after the Open Hillel name. And the idea is that it's for our members who are active in their own synagogues, trying to get conversations about Israel and Palestine going in their synagogue, which is very hard and very slow work. And they need support and strategizing together and that sort of thing. So there's some of that going on. But I sometimes hesitate because I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit outside of Jewish institutions, and I think inside Jewish institutions is some of the hardest place to change. And so because there's still so many unaffiliated people out there who need to find us, I think it actually probably is at this stage better to focus on those, but we are, for the people who are in our organization who are part of those institutions, we hope to support them in doing that kind of work. In terms of the one state, two state question, thank you for asking. JVP does not take a position on one state or two state. And our general reason for doing that is we don't think it's our job. We don't think as American Jews that we should be saying how many states Palestinians or Israelis need. We think that our job is very specifically to change U.S. policy so that the U.S. cannot, it does no longer continue to enable Israel to keep doing what it's doing with impunity. And of course we have some principles based on human rights and all the other, and equality and all the other things I talked about in the talk. But generally speaking, we do not take a position on that question. And while we're on the topic, I will say that I think the whole framing of how many states is right is an outmoded framing. I think that there are 2 states that you could theoretically imagine that could be, you could have a 2-state solution, which are complete Bantustans, demilitarized, no economic independence, no anything, not a real state at all. And theoretically, you could have 2 states that would work and that would be relatively okay. At the same time, there's a 1-state solution, which is a secular binational state, and there's also 1-state solutions, which people on the far right in Israel are talking about now all the time, quite openly, which is total annexation. So I think, the phrase 1 state and 2 state, which has become such a lightning rod and such a litmus test, I think doesn't talk at all about principles, and I think we need to be talking about principles, not about the number of states that we're talking about as a solution. The third question was about,
The lobby and whether it was.
the law,
or it was-
that's a super interesting question, right? Like whether it's within U.S. interests or if it's the power of the lobby. I think there's a big intersection between them all, and I think it's hard to pull out one. At some point, we tried to do like a little study. We interviewed like 20 people who were experts in different fields, and we're hoping that there was going to be some consensus about whether it's, is it the Christian evangelicals, or is it the Jewish wing of the lobby, or is it the military contractors, is it American military interests? And what we found was that there was nobody thought there was one answer in particular, which in some ways was very, very freeing because we realized we could pursue our own strategy. So I think, it's very dynamic, and I think it all comes into play. I do think now we've started having meetings with our members of Congress, just within the progressive caucus of the members of Congress, which is supposed to, of course, be the most progressive on this issue. I don't know how progressive they actually are. In some cases, not at all. But we've been having home district visits with them. And what we're finding is a real undercurrent of anger. Again, behind closed doors, not publicly. But a real sense of anger for people that they feel that they have to take these particular votes. And what I do think for sure is that once those 1 or 2 examples are proven that they can withstand the power of impact, that there will be a whole flood of people who will be willing to speak out, because right now they're really being held in place by fear of losing their job, and once that's a little bit mitigated, then they'll feel much more free, and a lot of people will follow.
Yes, there's 2 people on the back, but I have the one on the left.
Yes, we go together.
Okay, is it one question?
It's just a simple question, not the world's most important question, but when I was a new activist about 12 years ago, or what it's around about that time, I was aware of other Jewish groups, like Not in My Name and Jews Against Occupation. I wondered what has happened to them. And the other related question is, I just wonder what other sorts of groups there are which are non-Jewish. I've heard of Code Pink, and I just wondered if perhaps Jewish Voice of Peace is one of the leading groups. I think sometimes, probably more so in America, Jews can be more courageous because they're less worried about the task of anti-Semitism. I mean, in the BDS movement, there's lots of courageous people, but sometimes it's people say, oh, come on, we can do that. Yeah, come on, we can boycott that theatre. Come on, we can disrupt that prom. So I just wondered if you have that thing going on in the States. As I said, what sort of groups?
I wanted to ask about the PA's new strategy seeking international recognition of the Palestinian state. Because you mentioned briefly the British parliamentary vote, but of course since then Sweden has officially recognised Palestine, and more countries are likely to follow suit. And Abbas has now sent this draft resolution to the UN Security Council for recognition. And do you think there's any possibility that Obama may not use the US veto?
Are we going to there's a gentleman, red.
Yeah, so one of the things I've been thinking about, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is the difference between young Jewish voices in America and young Jewish voices in Britain. say, citing Peter Weinhardt, there seems to be this kind of cleavage between the older and the younger generation, and that doesn't really seem to be happening to the same extent over here. So you have Jewish groups like the Jewish Socialist Group, JFJP, Young Jewish Left, and a better group called Judas. But there doesn't seem to be the same kind of momentum and the same kind of numbers as there are in America. And if your only kind of analysis of why Jewish, young Jewish voices are becoming more critical of Israel is that Israel is doing steadily worse things, becoming more racist and more right-wing, then why do the shifts not happen equally over here and there? And I wonder whether the major kind of project for young Jews is building a cultural resistance to Zionism and to Israel, a kind of diaspora one, which is what Judas do, and the member of Judas, rather than explicitly kind of focusing on the issue of Israel-Palestine, because it's a question about identity. And that seems to be what American Jews have more than British Jews.
Sorry.
Don't touch the cable there. Rain Moss out. Love it. Take it back in. This will make a very loud noise. This will make a loud noise.
Okay. So the first question was about what had happened to some of the small groups like Not in My Name and JADO and all that sort, and other groups like that. There's sort of I didn't talk much about the history of JVP, but basically what started to happen is that JVP was very successful in the Bay Area, and smaller groups like Not in Our Name in Chicago, not JADO actually, but Not in Our Name certainly, and a lot of other, there was lots of sort of, we always call them the J's and the P's, because there's the Jews and Palestine and peace and justice, they're all J's and JP words. So there were all kinds of organizations that were named various JP things, and they started coming to us and saying, we like the model that you've developed, can we be involved? And so we eventually decided, with a lot of these organizations, including Not in Our Name, to become a national organization. And there was a period when that did not work well at all because they all had their sort of own individual personalities and established ways of working and that sort of thing. And so it was pretty hairy there for a couple of years. But now and we were quite careful, actually JADO is an amazing, I'm in New York now, I know all the old JADO people. JADO is an amazing organization and we specifically didn't expand to New York and to some of the other places where there are already very active, very, very good groups that are happening. And eventually, basically what happened is that now JVP has, I think, more or less absorbed most of those smaller local organizations and they act as local chapters. And JADO fell apart sort of on its own a couple of years ago, and now most of the JADO people are either working in JVP, and some of them are working with a local group called Adala New York, which does phenomenal BDS work in New York City. So that brings me to the second half of your question, which is around non-Jewish partners. JVP works with tons of organizations. We're members of the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, which is a coalition of 300 to 400 organizations working on this issue. We work with Code Pink. We work with Students for Justice in Palestine. We work with the USPCN. We've worked with all kinds of organizations that are part of, mostly through the BDS work. A lot of it's local, so like in New York, Adala New York, and there's other groups that locally that are very, very active. I do think on the question of like the Jewish group leading this work, there's a danger to it, and we try to be attentive to it. On the one hand, it's sort of the second half of what you were talking about, which is on the one hand, yes, we want to use what we have, which is the fact that as Jews, we often get more of a hearing. There's sort of a surprise factor of Jews speaking out on this issue. There's a certain power we have because we can say that, no, this isn't anti-Semitic, and we can help people have the bravery to speak out on this issue by supporting them so they don't feel like they're speaking out against Jews. So there's something very powerful about that. But the flip side of that is that there is Jewish privilege. And that we know we're dealing with a lot of Islamophobia in the United States, and that often people will hear Jewish voices but won't hear Palestinian voices. So we do try, and I think, it's an ever-evolving process, and we don't always do it perfectly, but we do try to be conscious of stepping back at the right times and stepping forward at the right times, and making space for Palestinian voices and other Arab and Muslim voices, which really have a lot more trouble being heard, and to challenge people, saying, why do you need a Jewish speaker this man? Wouldn't it be better to hear from Palestinian, or why don't we have a Palestinian along with us, that sort of thing. So it's a tricky balance, and I think it's important to be thinking about that all the time. So I have two more questions to take before I get to you. Your question is whether the U.S. would ever not veto the idea of a Palestinian state. No, I don't think so. Not anytime soon. And I will say, the whole strategy around the statehood bid, I think what's scary about this statehood strategy is there's no, this vote that happened in Parliament a couple weeks ago, it was sort of inspiring in that so many people voted for it. But there was no definition of what that Palestinian state would look like. And it didn't deal at all with the issue of refugees, and it didn't deal at all with the issue of Palestinians inside of Israel. So there's some problems with the strategy, I think, from that perspective, and that's not inclusive of all Palestinians. And it also is just, it as of now doesn't seem like it offers enough definition to know exactly what it is. So I think there's some issues there. Where was the third question? Oh, yeah, the question around young Jews. That's really, really interesting what you're saying. And I think it's really legit. And I think that everyone probably should do the things that make the most sense for them. And I do think there's probably something, again, I've had 3 days here, so I don't know. But the Jewish community is clearly a lot smaller here. And it feels to me at least a little bit more precarious in some way. Or that it at least has the sense of being more precarious than the Jewish American community does. And also my impression is that there's a much sort of stronger pipeline from Jewish schools and Jewish camps that a lot of Jewish kids are in here in the UK, and so that there's less of that room for the unaffiliated or to be out of that pipeline. So I think all of those things are factors. But I certainly think it makes sense to do different things in different places because of course local conditions are different.
Okay, we're going to take one last round of questions, and I think what I saw beforehand, so we'll try and do 4 and then we can round up. So is the gentleman that has his hand up before?
Yes, I think that the idea of saying we're Jewish and we think this, that it's a workable idea, but I don't think it's all that sustainable, because already I see on the Zionist Federation website that the talk is that all these JP organizations, as you call them, that these JP organizations are being dismissed as mere fronts that make anti-Semitism respectable. That's the way that the Zionist narrative is now going to package us away. And my suggestion as an alternative or a development from that is that instead of just saying that we're Jewish, we think this, why not put forward the principles of Judaism itself, which strike at the heart of Zionism and which are also universal principles, such as the 7th commandment, that you shouldn't covet not only your neighbour's wife, which is the one that everyone learns at school, it does actually say your neighbour's land you shouldn't covet. And Jewish land law itself in the Gemara Baba Basra, which says that the true owner of land is the person that holds the title deeds, which must surely include many, many Palestinian families who have title deeds, but now no land anymore. And even where title deeds have been lost, Jewish land law says that the ownership belongs to the person who has cultivated that ground regularly. And so actually Judaism itself is at stake here. And not only that, but all these things that I've just mentioned are universally admired. That's why most people in the world agree with Palestinians. And we could say it's almost a triumph for Judaism that actually most of the world agrees with Judaism because they don't agree with Zionism.
Gentleman in the front.
Thank you. You talk about the anti-Semitism, and certainly the organisation that I'm involved in, which is linking one city in Britain with one city out in Palestine, and the anti-Semitism bit does arrive. And certainly what we would like to see is actually some involvement by people who are Jewish, so that in effect we are broad in our take. We are not anti-Semitic. By the way, I don't see how we can be, because actually Palestinians are actually more Semitic actually than Jews currently, because they haven't suffered diaspora yet, but the Jews have suffered for the last 2,000 years. And so what we certainly want to see is actually some involvement by Jewish people. But also too, I was surprised with your slogan, Israelis and Palestinians, two peoples, one future. And yet, you don't actually come down and say one state from the Jordan Valley to the Med. Exactly, you touched on it. But actually to quite say so, because frankly, the two-state solution, in any way, Pakistan or otherwise, is actually gone. There are far too many. The other thing I just would make is a comment on that, and that is actually why you've done it.
Was there a question? Sorry, did you ask a question?
Yeah, the question I think really is how do we get people involved from the Jewish community as well in order to negate the problems that we've got, only being called anti-Semites?
Thank you. We have a gentleman in the back, and then there was someone in the front, and that will be the last.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, thanks for your great talk, it's really inspirational. I just wanted to ask what you thought about engaging with young Muslim groups. So I don't have a huge amount of experience with Jewish action groups, but I worry sometimes when I engage with young and older Muslim groups and demos and things like this, that there is a lot of anti-Semitism within the sort of less perhaps knowledgeable or older generation particularly. And I just wondered how you in America or what your thoughts were about here in terms of trying to integrate kind of the unified approach of achieving peace and justice and things like that, but how do you come into contact with any of that and how you dealt with it, sort of how to open the dialogue? And obviously this is a great place to do it because of the umbrella organisations doing it, but that's great for people as well.
And last question.
My question to you, Rebecca, is what would you do if you were the Prime Minister of Israel?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Give her the microphone and ask her to speak loud, so I hear well.
The Jewish values question. Judaism. Yeah, I mean, I think your point is a really well taken one and clearly well received. And JDP does talk a lot about Jewish values. Tzedek to go for love, justice, you shall pursue. There's all kinds of things that you could quote, of course, as you did briefly, that support our position. And we do that. And I think I also think it would be dishonest to say that we have a lock on Judaism, because there's also a lot of things you could quote in Judaism that don't sound so good. You just have to be honest about that. You hear a lot of you hear a lot of right-wing people also quoting from the Torah, accurate quotations that present the opposite side. So I think it's honest to be able to say our Jewish values and our Judaism, because it's an accurate and real reflection of what our Judaism is. But we can't honestly say that Judaism itself has those exact values, because the truth is, and it's not just Judaism, by the way, it's every major religion. I think you can pick good things out of every major religious text, and you pick some pretty bad things out of every major religious text. So we have to be realistic about that. Where's the second one?
Question two.
Oh, yes. Well, I think your question, the gentleman's question in the back, is in some ways related. I mean, I think first of all, you need to do outreach to people. You need to invite them in. And I think, generally having anti-racist principles general anti-racist principles, whether it's against anti-Arab racism, or anti-Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism, or any kind of racism, is critically important. And being willing to say those things out loud. Now, it was very interesting to hear your comment, because actually my experience, quite honestly, in the United States is I honestly can't think of a single time that I've experienced any kind of anti-Semitism from anyone Muslim. Now, Christians are a different matter. There's Christian hegemony still in the United States, and it often comes in a kind of like, could be almost like a flattering form, like, oh, you Jews are so smart. But, it's nevertheless, it's a kind of generalization that I think is not appropriate, and I think it's very, very important when we set up a coalition, and of course everyone's on a journey, right? And so, obviously there's some people I'm not going to work with if they say things that are really vile, but if it's a question of education and thinking about how you're expressing things, and even just getting to know someone, like you have a lot of Palestinians in Palestine who have never seen a Jewish person except for as a soldier, an occupying soldier, and of course they have some bad feelings about Jews, and that is understandable. So I think that that's the generalization they've ended up making. So I think we need to be able to have those conversations honestly, and be gently challenging to our friends, and be willing to hold the line and say, look, if you want to work with us, you have to, that we're all holding to anti-racist principles, and if your Jewish partners are doing things that are racist or Islamophobic or whatever, you hold them to those standards, and you hold your own people to those standards, and that's how we not only do this work with integrity, but really start to build these anti-racist frameworks. If I was the Prime Minister. Wow. Well, I don't know that I can answer that exact question. But I will say, and I think that, certainly the Israeli government has made the one thing they have not tried at all, of all the things they've tried, they've really never tried any kind of peace, let alone just peace. Like, they've never even considered the idea of ending the occupation in any serious kind of way. And what I will say is that one of the things that inspires me the most is my mother-in-law, who's Israeli. She was born in Jerusalem in the 1930s, and her politics themselves are not fantastic now, but she talks about her childhood in Jerusalem and how her father spoke Arabic, and he spoke Hebrew, and he spoke Yiddish, and he spoke other languages, and Jerusalem was not a utopia, but it was a place that people lived together and worked together and celebrated together and had lives together, and that was less than a lifetime ago. So the idea that this is an intractable conflict and peace can't be made and people can't live with one another and that sort of thing, that reminds me of your thing. You're right, I don't love this two people's own future. That's kind of outdated. I wouldn't really use it that much anymore either because I brought here. So, sure. Just because what we have. I think that's from a previous generation of JVP. But that is something that is graspable, that there is, that people can be their best selves. I mean, it sounds a little like, hippy-dippy maybe, but I think the point is that it's really important as we do this work to remember that nothing is unchangeable, that in the lifespan of my mother-in-law, she's gone from living in a Jerusalem without borders to living in one that does have borders, and that in the same way that things have changed so much in those 60 years, that they can change back. And so that is the place that I would start if I was Prime Minister.
Thank you. Okay. Before closing the evening and thanking Rebecca for her beautiful work and the work of her organization, I'd just like to talk about a few other organizations. And the first one is Jews for Justice for Palestinians, who has been working with Jewish Voice for Peace. It does some of the similar things and some slightly different things, but it's about Jews in this country working for justice for Palestinians, and we happen to have a very distinguished member of Jews for Justice for Palestinians here tonight, who will take anybody's email if they want to know about the website and the work of Jews for Justice for Palestinians. Glenn, there he is, stand up. So if you want to do this, I think you have a piece of paper and a pen, don't you?
Yeah.
You take email addresses.
People want to, any Jews here want to join us, give us your name. Anyone who is not Jewish and wants to support us and join our friends of Jews for Justice for Palestinians, also come up, give us your name and your contact details. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Okay, now the other two organizations, three actually, I just want to mention. One is the student group here at King's, who have been very active for many, many, many years, generations of them, and I've come and spoken so many times on Palestine, on all kinds of issues. They work not only on issues for Palestine, but for justice, for human rights, against the cuts, on all types of issues. You will find the groups, student groups on Palestine at the heart of all of those progressive movements. So I just wanted to mention them. I'm a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is hosting this evening. And so they're doing extraordinary work around the country in meetings all over, not only in London, but in Oxford, where I live, up north, and everywhere else. And they have a very good student and activist coordinator who is also here tonight, Rachel. So if any of the students are here that want to get involved in the work on Palestine, to get in touch with her. And I'm the patron of another organization, which is the London Palestine Film Foundation, which is, I think it's 14th or 15th year, yeah. And they're opening at the South Bank as usual on the 28th of November. And so I encourage everybody to come to that as well. An extraordinary festival, the biggest in all this Palestine Film Festival. And so with all of that, it remains just to all of us, what a friendly and safe space evening we have had. And I think we all could be sitting with Rebecca for hours and hours talking about the work she's been doing, and so encouraged by this for all of us in this struggle for justice for all our peoples, wherever we are. And so can we all just thank Rebecca again for